man you're watching talked to Pablo Escobar at Hacienda Nápoles is not an employee. They called him El Mexicano. He wasn't Mexican. His name was José Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha. He was Colombian, and he had never lived in Mexico. Gacha built the Medellín Cartel with Pablo Escobar. But while Escobar was doing what everybody else was doing, he was doing something else. And the Mexican cartels that run the business today exist because of this man. Nobody has ever explained where his taste for Mexico came from. He played Mexican music at his parties. He filled his stables with horses and dressed like a ranchero in a country where nobody dressed like that. The men around him started calling him El Mexicano. Nobody ever called him anything else again. He named his farms after Mexican towns, his bar too, and his ranch. But none of those places was in Mexico. They were all a few hours from the town where he was born. He was building Mexico inside Colombia. But before he could put a name on a single farm, he had to buy it, and his first money didn't come from cocaine. It came from greenstones. He started in emeralds. In the 70s, he went to Muzo in Boyacá to work for the man they called the Czar of the Mines. Stones you could close your hand around, and buyers who paid in cash and asked nothing. That was the education. He learned how something worth a fortune leaves a country quietly. But he did not stay a hired man. He learned how the money worked, and in time he walked out with his own crew. The problem was that emeralds ran out. He had a ceiling. Cocaine did not. In 1976, he moved to Medellín and went in with Pablo Escobar and the men who would later be called the Medellín Cartel. He was never Escobar's employee, and two facts settle it. On June 20th, 1988, Forbes put him on its list of the richest men on earth next to Pablo Escobar. And when the government put a price on the cartel's leadership, it offered 100 million pesos for Gacha, and exactly the same for Escobar. On paper, they were worth the same, but they said El Mexicano was even more violent than Pablo. Escobar spent his life fighting Colombia. Gacha spent his looking north at the country that had given him his name. In the late 70s, Colombian cocaine went north through the Caribbean, boats and small planes into Florida. Carlos later ran an entire island in the Bahamas to feed that route. Escobar shipped through it for years. Nobody was being clever. It was the road that worked and everybody was on it. But Gacha went the other way. He looked at the land border. Almost 2,000 miles of desert and river between Mexico and the United States, and not 1 mile of it belonged to a Colombian. Nobody needed that border. There was no business reason to be in Mexico at all. What Gacha had was a taste for a country he had never lived in. So he built the road anyway, overland into Los Angeles and Houston. But to run it, he needed men who owned that border, so he went to the men who did. Mexico already had smugglers. Their biggest was Pedro Avilés, out of Sinaloa. Since the 60s, he had been running marijuana across that border, and he was the first man in Mexico to put it on a plane. He had the routes and the police and the customs men on the payroll. But he had never moved cocaine, and neither had anyone else in Mexico. They grew marijuana, they ran heroin. Cocaine came out of South America, and the South Americans kept it. Avilés was shot dead by federal police in September 1978. The men he had trained took his routes: Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero, and a nephew of his, a young man from Badiraguato named Joaquín Guzmán. The best smuggling infrastructure in the hemisphere, running marijuana. Gacha handed them cocaine, but he did not make them partners. They took delivery in northern Mexico, drove the load across and left it in a stash house for a Colombian to collect. They were paid a fee in cash by the trip. The product was never theirs, the buyers were never theirs. The price was set in Colombia by him. They were subcontractors. Gacha had a logistics problem and he had solved it cheaply. But years later, the Americans closed the Caribbean. They took Lader's Island. The boats were seized, the pilots arrested, and the road everybody was on stopped working. And the only road left was the one Gacha had opened years earlier when nobody needed it. So every kilo that left Colombia now went through his men. You can measure what that was worth by what he bought with it. He bought a horse for $1 million and called it Tupac Amaru. When buyers offered him $4 million for it, he said no. One day, the police came to the farm to seize it. They took a look-alike. The real one was in an apartment in Bogota. It had its own vet. On the main square of Pacho, across from the church, he opened a nightclub and named it Chihuahua. They said it was the best in the region. He drank whiskey on the balcony and watched his own town move underneath him. He handed out cash in the street, and there is film of people taking it and thanking him. At Cuernavaca, he built a gym, a chapel, a helipad, a stable for 50 horses. The one thing he never finished was the airstrip. Escobar had one at Hacienda Nápoles. El Mexicano had something better than an airstrip. He had the border. But across the border, the men who moved his cocaine were still being paid by the trip. To Gacha, they were drivers. He had 10 years to notice what they were becoming. He never did. The men who carried his cocaine spent 10 years learning the business from the inside. They learned the buyers. They learned exactly how badly Colombia needed them. And in 1989, they used it. They were owed money, so they held a Colombian load in a warehouse in Los Angeles and refused to hand it over. American agents found the warehouse, around 20 tons of cocaine, the largest seizure the United States had ever made. Nobody could take a loss like that twice. So the Colombians came back with a new arrangement. Instead of paying the Mexicans a fee, they would pay them in cocaine, up to half of every load. The DEA's own history of the trade calls that the change that rewrote everything. Because a man who is paid in cocaine owns cocaine. He has to find his own buyers on the American side, and once he has them, he does not need a Colombian to sell for him. He needs a Colombian to grow for him. Escobar was killed in 1993. 2 years later, the leadership in Cali was in prison and the Colombian networks were coming apart. But the Mexicans did not come apart. They had the border, they had the customers, and they were the only ones who could put a kilo into an American city. Colombia kept growing the cocaine. The men who decided what happened to it were in Mexico, and the biggest of them all had started as one of those drivers, Joaquin Guzman Loera, El Chapo. The warehouse in Los Angeles was opened on September 28, 1989. Gacha was alive when it happened, but he was running, moving between towns with the army behind him. He had 11 weeks left. By 1989, the Colombian state was at war with the cartel and hunting the men who ran it. El Mexicano kept moving farm to farm, then town to town. By December, he had run all the way to the Caribbean coast, far from home. But the man who gave him up was inside his own operation. Jorge Velázquez, known as El Navegante, was an informant for the Cali Cartel. He passed on where Gacha was. On December 15, 1989, police commandos came in by helicopter near Tolu, a fishing town on the Caribbean coast. El Mexicano tried to leave on foot. He did not get far. His son Freddy died with him. He was 17 years old. The official account was that a bullet killed him. Others say that cornered, he chose a grenade over being taken alive, because the one thing a Medellín boss truly feared was not death. It was extradition. They would take a grave in Colombia over a cell in the United States. They identified the body by fingerprints. The news went out that afternoon and people came into the streets to celebrate. He was 42. He was the first of the men who built the Medellín Cartel to die. He died believing the Mexicans worked for him. But the men who were drivers own the business now. Nobody calls them employees. Nobody has for 30 years. Everything El Mexicano built in Colombia is gone. The only thing still standing is the door he opened. The drivers who started out carrying other men's boxes now move more cocaine than Gacha moved in his entire life. And they have become organizations that challenge entire governments for control. The violence bleeding Mexico today, the mass graves, the emptied towns, the hundreds of thousands of dead, began with an arrangement that once looked to someone like a good idea. He never knew the damage that would come after. Thanks for watching this video. If it earned your time, hit like and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and the next file is already on my desk. I'll see you there.